So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Friday briefing at JW3. In case anybody doesn't know me, I'm Judy Trotter, Head of Adult Education, and a special welcome to our guest this morning, Izabella Taborovsky. Izabella is a scholar with the Kennan Institute and Wilson Center, based in Washington. She's based in Israel, and one of the 65 contributors to the book Jewish Priorities, which we're launching at JW3. I hope you will see, but you'll be hearing more about on April the 15th, where Izabella will be joining us in London, so we get to meet her in person as well. So as always, please put your questions in the chat as the half hour progresses. Don't wait till the end. And so as we approach 6 months, which the date will be on Sunday, what a hard week we've had, as always, but this one was again unexpected. So as always, it's not what we're going to concentrate on this morning because everything had been planned beforehand, but obviously we have to acknowledge what happened. So Izabella, it's always a hard task that we set, but thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And what would you like to share with us this morning? Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to also visiting in a couple of weeks or in 10 days and being in London. I always admire the Jews of Great Britain. I think that you know what you've done when you fought the danger from Jeremy Corbyn's readership, I think is very impressive. I think it's something that American Jews really need to learn. And get better at. So I'll say a couple of words about myself, and then there's a kind of to explain my perspective on things. So I am based in Israel now. I grew up in the USSR. We emigrated to the United States in 1990, which I guess at this point is 34 years ago. And I came to Israel in 2020, so it was Corona. I was finally able to come because I was working remotely. Everybody was working remotely, and I had a research project here, and I wanted to make Aliyah for a long time. It never worked, but it finally did. And so here I am. So I was here on October 7th, and I'm here now. I think, I'll reference what Judy said about this week having been really hard. I think that this week was one of the examples of how the anti-Israel kind of propaganda works. I'm a scholar of anti-Israel propaganda, anti-Zionist propaganda, and how it connects with anti-Semitism. I began studying it when I realized several years ago, I think in 2017 or 18, when I noticed how this radical anti-Israel, anti-Zionist rhetoric that was just flowing through American campuses, how similar it was to what we used to hear back in the USSR. And it got me intrigued, and I started studying it, and I've written a lot about that. And I mean, essentially 99% probably of what we're hearing today from the left comes from originally from Soviet sources through their propaganda campaign. So I've been studying anti-Zionism as propaganda, which I think is poorly understood. I think a lot of times we still think about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as not simply, but as hate, right, as prejudice. I think it's more than that, and I can get into that. I mean, it's a tool for states, for regimes, for authoritarian regimes in particular, to direct against democracies, against Western societies. It's certainly something that we see today. Deborah Lipstadt talks about it a lot. But what I wanted to say is, when I found myself here after October 7th, one thing that became really striking is, when you're in a diaspora and you experience anti-Semitism, it's one thing. It's very strong, and you feel, it's one thing. When you're here, it feels different. It's like, on the one hand, inside the society, you feel like, okay, so you are with people who are like you, and so you don't have to, it's almost like a safe space that you have. You're inside a state that resists that itself just by its own existence. But on the other hand, you feel very strongly the hate that's coming from all over the world, right? From all directions. So there are physical threats, but then also all of the reporting, all of the, I mean, you really feel like, I mean, I feel it like it's because I pay attention to it, you know, because I follow it. I don't know if all Israelis feel it. You know, I think a lot of Israelis tune it out, but I follow it. And so you feel like there, it's like, I don't know, there are sharp objects that are being targeted at you all the time. And because you see the society from the inside, you also realize just how ridiculous and absurd and conspiracy theory ridden these speculations are. So just what happened this week with the 7-8 workers, I mean, a tragic accident, right? Really a mistake, horrible. I mean, Israelis feel terrible about it. But it's also obvious to us because we know how the IDF operates. We know it because families send their children to serve in the IDF, right? So it's not like some kind of abstract entity. It's a very concrete connection that essentially every Israeli, I mean, I don't have anybody in the IDF, but as part of the nation, it's like you feel like this is something that you're really connected to. So and you know the rules, and basically, every mother has the telephone number of her son's or daughter's commander, and she can reach them at any time. So that it's really ridiculous to say that the IDF targeted this convoy on purpose. And so the disconnect, the really incredible disconnect between the reality and the way people just go into outer space with conspiracy theories is truly incredible. So this week I posted, just I think yesterday, I posted an article by a British commentator, Brendan O'Neill. Some people know him. He wrote this piece in The Spectator. He mostly writes in Spiked. I don't really know, people may have attitudes about these different outlets. I don't, because I don't live in the UK. I just like him as a commentator. So he does a very good job analyzing just the conspiratorial nature of this kind of discourse about Israel, and also the duplicity of it. He talks about how when Western societies, from Britain to the UK, go and fight in wars, and they make mistakes like this. I mean, this kind of friendly fire incidents happen all the time. They make mistakes like this. It's treated as tragedy, but it's not treated as intentional, an intentional murder. So it's somebody that I read and recommend reading. I think it's one of the few sane voices on the subject. He doesn't strike me as partisan. Anyway, but it's one of the things that I want to say, I think, is how when you're here and connected to reality, you really see with greater clarity just how much conspiracy theory there is out there, and how it builds on years and decades and centuries of conspiracy theory about Jews. It's the same tropes, it's the same kind of ideas, it's the same suspicions. The Jews that they control the world, and if they say Zionists control the world, or Jews are evil versus Zionists are evil, it's the same trope. It doesn't matter. And so, what I've been thinking about, so before October 7th, I spent a lot of time talking to and writing. I mostly write in tablet. I've also written for Fathom. I spent a lot of time kind of really making the case that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't have to be in theory, but in reality, it almost always is. And I used historical example of how it was used in Soviet times as propaganda to make this case. And I think that after October, and before October 7th, I know that some people were convinced, but not everybody. And if you probably remember how we were all kind of thinking about, so much of it was about, well, is it really, is it not the same? Which anti-Semitism is worse, left wing or right wing? Is anti-Zionism criticism of Israel or not? And I think after October 7th, my case really was made. I don't feel like I need to be proving it anymore. I think a growing number of people understand this. And by the way, including in Israel also, a lot of people felt like, maybe these claims, especially left-wing Israelis, felt that, well, these claims that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it's just Bibi, or it's just right-wingers trying to use this situation or anti-Semitism for political purposes. And I recently had a conversation with an Israeli who does a lot of public diplomacy, and it was interesting. She started saying, kind of like, I think habitually, how that anti-Zionism maybe not the same as anti-Semitism. And then she caught herself and she said, you know what, I'm going to take this back. This is something I used to say before October 7th. And now I realize that I see that the things that people say about Israel, it's just purely anti-Semitic. It's so built, so much, given how it's built on conspiracy theory. So what I've been thinking a lot about, and I'll go back to what Deborah Lipstadt says these days, she's been speaking with growing urgency about anti-Semitism as a favorite tool of authoritarian regimes that use it to undermine Western societies. I mean, that the fact that anti-Zionist propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda can be used by authoritarian regimes is something we know from history, right? It's like, again, so the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign went on for decades, and it had a profound influence on the Western left, in the UK especially. I spent a lot of time researching anti-Semitism in the UK and the left's perceptions of Israel over decades, and you can see that the influence is there. And so I think what we're missing today in dealing with it is this understanding that it's not only sort of prejudice that individuals experience on their own, right? That they propagate on their own. There is money behind it. There are state actors who are behind it. Certainly, once Israel becomes involved, you get into the territory of, well, Israel is the ally of the US. And if the regime is anti-American, then it is also kind of by definition going to be anti-Israel. And I would say vice versa, because over and over again, we see anti-American rhetoric going together with anti-Israel rhetoric, and probably anti-British as well. I just primarily study kind of things in the American context. That's why I say it. And we know, of course, that America is, in Iran's perception, the great Satan, right? And Israel is a little Satan. So you see Russia getting active in this field after October 7th. Russia, of course, Russia created a lot of this propaganda, but then for about 30 years, it stopped participating in it because it stopped fulfilling its political purposes, its foreign policy needs. And then after October 7th, and it was very friendly with Israel, and then after October 7th, things changed again. And you see, again, like people ask me, well, is Russia anti-Semitic? The thing is, I almost feel like it's an irrelevant question when it comes to state actors, because, is Putin anti-Semitic or not? It almost doesn't matter. Putin does what suits him politically. I'm going to have a piece coming out on it soon. After October 7th, the situation changed, and it no longer suited his interests to be friendly with Israel. And so he returned to what very much is reminiscent of the Soviet policy of standing by Hamas and Palestinian terrorist groups, understanding that he can use them for his own political purposes, restoring connections with various Arab countries, and using that in kind of positioning Russia as being against the West, as being against the United States, and therefore also being against Israel. We see China increasingly using anti-Semitic propaganda on TikTok and social media. And that is something that I understand to be new on Chinese social media. I'm not an expert on China, but this is what Deborah Lipstadt's office says, that this is, the Chinese social media didn't used to use anti-Semitism like this. And now they do, because again, the political situation has changed and it suits them to do this. They see that the West is on the retreat. The West is being weak. The West is in disarray. The West is kind of fighting against each other. One group against each other is extreme polarization, and so they're using kind of this heavy weaponry. And then, of course, there is Qatar, which we now know has invested billions of dollars, certainly in American universities. And there's an extraordinary study that came out last week that talks about how Qatari, wherever there were funds from not just Qatar, but broader speaking from authoritarian regimes, undisclosed funds, meaning undisclosed to the Department of Education in the US, but they were not secret. The universities, issued press releases about them, which is how researchers know about them, but they didn't disclose the receipt of these funds to departments of education for various reasons. So wherever a campus had this kind of undisclosed money from authoritarian, especially Middle Eastern regimes, the incidence of anti-Semitism there was at least 300% higher than in other places. There's a correlation. We don't know the causation, but there's a correlation. So I think that this is something that we all need to start thinking about more. We need to start thinking about anti-Zionism and anti-Israel propaganda that we're seeing today from that perspective, from the perspective of state actors investing massive amounts of money into it. And it's important to do it, because I think if there weren't that many resources, we wouldn't be seeing such a volume of hatred that we're seeing right now directed at Israel. And then, of course, it spills into hatred against Jews. As I've always warned against Soviet Jews, always knew that once anti-Zionism, or if you experienced anti-Zionism under the USSR and you understand that history, then you know that when a society embraces anti-Zionism, then all Jews are in danger. Then every Jew becomes a target of being potentially called a Zionist, and then with the consequences of whatever the society now wants Zionists, whatever punishment the society wants Zionists to experience. So this is what's been on my mind, and I've realized that I've talked less about Israel than about kind of the research that's been on my mind and the thinking that's been on my mind about this propaganda. But I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about Israel, what's going on now. I know you had a briefing by David Hazoni last week. He's, of course, an excellent resource on this, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Izabella. So let's start with that. What some of your experiences over the last 6 months. Obviously, you've been researching, and I think that always helps. And I thank you for such a depressing analogy on your research, but how wonderfully delivered, so that it didn't feel depressing until you actually thought about what the content was.
We have to diagnose the problem, so I think once we diagnose it, we can find solutions. If we don't diagnose it, then we can't find solutions.
Okay, I'm gonna break with tradition, because I can see Richard's put his hand up rather than putting it in. So let me just now you can unmute yourself, Richard. You can ask your own question.
Good morning, Judy. Good morning, Izabella. Thank you for your very instructive talk. I am actually a post-retirement PhD student in the UK, doing a PhD on Holocaust and genocide. And because of what happened on 7th of October, I'm changing tack as far as my dissertation is concerned, because bordering on what you were saying about the situation when a society embraces anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, all Jews are in danger. I think we're on the cusp of a similar type of experience in the UK. I've lived here all my life. I'm 67, and I've never noticed such an outcry of anti-Semitism, not only from the left, but also from the Muslim community, unfortunately, and from the media as well. Have you, in your research, carried out any work yet on Muslim anti-Semitism in the UK?
Or elsewhere, I would guess, Richard.
Well, elsewhere we sort of know about,
okay.
But I think this is a fairly new phenomenon in the UK.
All right, thank you.
So I haven't looked specifically into Muslim anti-Semitism unless I look at it I mean, I've only kind of touched on it in the context of my research into left-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. What's interesting about that is, as the Soviets were developing their ideas, and redefining Zionism from what it really is into this perception that we see today, that Zionism is colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, genocide, fascism, all of the things. I mean, you really see it already. All the things that we hear today, you already see it in Soviet literature in the 1960s, in Soviet propaganda literature. And we see connections there. So the Soviets were very close to Arab states, right? They viewed them as their close allies. And there is one case, it's anecdotal, but I believe that it's indicative of the broader trends, is that so in one case, researchers were able to trace some of the Soviet anti-Zionist specific kind of terminology the Soviets were using. They were able to trace it to some of the Arab propaganda, anti-Zionist propaganda that was emanating from Egypt in the 1950s. And at the time, by the way, Egypt's anti-Israel propaganda machine was run by a former Nazi. So that's just to help us understand, right? That these things are, I think that one thing that we're seeing after October 7th is how notional these divisions really are. The left-wing, right-wing, Muslim, when it all flares up together, it feeds into one another. And when you look at the origins of it all, you can also trace it in many times to the same sources. Like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion played a massive role, both on the far right and on the far left, and in Muslim anti-Semitism, right? Because we know that Christians brought the protocols, and the Soviets also spread the protocols, and the Nazis also spread the protocols in the Arab world. So in the end, there are a lot of similarities there. So anyway, so this is just to say that, we see connections, and I think that at least in the Soviet Arab case, which would mean the Soviet Arab also means the left-wing Arab, right? Because the Soviets passed their worldview onto the global left in the developing world with regards to Jews and Israel. And so, the left-wing alliance goes back a long way. And so I think that there are connections, but I haven't looked specifically more deeply into Muslim anti-Semitism. And forgive me, I kind of used your question to go into my own thing. I apologize.
Thank you. A question from Jacqueline. You talked about the diagnosis of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Do you have any suggestions for what the treatment could be?
Well, I mean, that is really, that's, if I had the answer, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now in. I think a lot of us are struggling for the answer. Look, when the Soviets went full-on anti-Zionist, and by the way, they were always anti-Zionist, but when they really went full-on conspiracist and kind of big, massive scale, once they defined Zionism as the ideological enemy, which this happened in 1967, as a result of Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, and that whole, it really swept the society. What began to happen is that immediately Jews realized that they need to leave because they started to experience discrimination, more discrimination than ever. There was impact on their ability to enter educational, universities, and there was impact on their careers. And I've been writing about how we already have been seeing this in the West, in the US now for several years. I think that in the USSR, it stopped. They stopped propagating these ideas only when they realized that it didn't suit them politically. So when the USSR fell apart, basically, they stopped the propaganda because there was also no money anymore. So I keep going back to the idea of money. It's just something that's been on my mind a lot because really it has to be fueled. For it to reach the levels that we're seeing today, it has to be fueled by cash. There is money who is supporting Students for Justice in Palestine? Who is funding all these demonstrations? They're coming with, where is this coming from? I think we need to understand this, right? The research into the Qatari funding of American universities helps us to kind of get a glimpse into it, but we don't know who funds Students for Justice in Palestine. They have some kind of a legal structure that prevents us from knowing. Honestly, for this to be solved on a big picture level, I think we need to look at it from this perspective. On the kind of community level, of course, education seems to be the answer, except that it hasn't worked really until now. At the same time, I think it hasn't worked because, at least in the US, I don't know how it's been in the UK, but in the US, most of the education that was supposed to prevent anti-Semitism was geared around the Holocaust education. And so people thought that if more people learn about the Holocaust And if more people meet Holocaust survivors, then they will understand that anti-Semitism is so bad and they will not use it. Except that the anti-Semitism that we see today comes in a completely different form, and people don't understand it. So they even kind of the good faith people who perhaps really do want to avoid being anti-Semitic, they may not understand that what they learned, so like if they went through some Holocaust education course, they may very well get an impression that anti-Semitism only comes in the form of, in the like with a swastika and Nazi uniform and jackboots, and that's what anti-Semitism looks like. And that's why for so many people on the left, it's so hard to even accept that they can be anti-Semitic. They say, well, Nazis are anti-Semitic. We are not anti-Semitic. We don't know what it, socialists are against all forms of hate. And so I think that one way of doing it, and that will require kind of a massive structural effort, I think, for Jewish organizations, is to introduce education that focuses on left-wing anti-Semitism, helps to explain where does anti-Semitism on the left come from? How does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? We haven't introduced this teaching at all. And in fact, in the US, I would say that people don't even really know much about the USSR, or they think of it as having been the opponent of the Nazis and having been the good one, right? So I think that that kind of education is important. And again, it's a big effort. And I keep going back to the idea of money because, sometimes I sit in a circle of researchers and I realize that, we are all here just kind of part-timers doing it on our free time, doing all this research. We're in a battle of ideas, and the other side is financed by state actors, billions of dollars. And I think we as a community, as a people, need to understand that there are a lot of radically new ideas that we need to start introducing in order to just help people understand how it is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. How is it that anti-Zionism is not the same as criticism of Israel? Criticism of Israel is criticism of Israel, but anti-Zionism is to claim that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. So that's kind of my very I often feel people ask me what are the solutions, and people will say, well, give me 3 points that can help us improve our message. And I say, I hate to say it, I hate to disappoint people, but I don't think that there are shortcuts. The other side has been preparing for this moment for decades, and I think we were not prepared. And so we have to understand that it won't be achieved through a better PR message. I really don't think so. I think it's a deeper.
Almost answered the next question, which was surely the answer should be better hasbara from Israeli spokespeople and better pro-Israel communications from the Jewish UK community. And again, that's relevant to around the world. I don't know if you wanted to add any more to that. I mean, obviously.
Well, I do. I have to say. I mean, I hear certainly this a lot, that Israel's hasbara is not good enough. Unfortunately, there's always room for improvement. When Eilon Levy was doing it, I thought that he really did a very good job. And it's really unfortunate that he was, removed from that position. But I don't know if he did a great job. Was that enough? I don't know. When he was doing it, people were still saying that we need better hasbara. I mean, I think better hasbara still has to be grounded in certain ideas, and what are the ideas? It's something that we need to figure out, and we need to explain. Deeper explanations are needed. So I'm afraid that, again, because the field is so uneven, that no matter how, everything gets perverted, right? I can see we're running out of time, but like the fact that when Israel talks about, touts its progressive politics with regards to the LGBTQ community, it immediately gets perverted, and people say, well, they're just pinkwashing. They're just using the gay people for their propaganda, right? Israel can talk about innovations, and it will get reversed like this, so it's a very uneven field, and I think we have to manage our expectations with regards to what kind of your regular hasbara effort can do.
Thank you. You're right. And I have loads of questions here. I'm going to, one of them is about Jews in the Arab lands, which is more a comment about that they need to be brought into the story as well.
I'm sorry, who did you say? Who needs to be brought
in the Arab lands?
Oh, yes.
So that sorry, I lost my thought process then, in order to be able to understand the current situation now. So I'm going to send you that in an email. Thank you, Carmen.
Okay. Great.
And one of the questions also was about, we know long-term solutions still very far away, but in the short term, do you see an end to the war anytime soon? And I'm going to assume on your behalf that you don't, because I haven't come across anyone that does, but let me know if you're wrong. If I'm wrong, do you see any signs of hope?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think the timing of the end depends on how quickly Israel is able to enter Rafah and dismantle Hamas and return the hostages. You know, I feel that the international community in a way is creating delays, perhaps. I think that the United States is perhaps creating delays. Or maybe not, you know, I mean, the war, it's not, I don't know. I mean, the IDF is fighting, you know, it's just had this operation in Shifa. So it's not like the war has been suspended, but very much now hinges, I think, on how quickly Israel can go into Rafah. As far as I can tell, there is nobody in Israel who wants Israel to stop. You know, they feel like doing so would be, you know, like one of the expression was, you know, putting out 80% of a fire, right, and leaving 20% burning. So, so that's really the question. And then of course there is the north. I mean, the north is what's really worrying Israelis as well, where that will go. So yeah, not in the next couple of months, I would say.
No, it's such a difficult situation, and we feel for you and all of us. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
To actually meet you, and now you're not this unknown quality that's coming in April, so in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks time.
Yeah, I'd love to. I hope people come. I think it'll be a really good conversation. So sure do join us.
After this morning, it's been a pleasure meeting you and listening to you, and I look forward to more conversations by email. And you can follow Izabella on Twitter if anyone's still on that, now known as X. And look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. Thank you, Izabella. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and may it be a safe.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.